You know, in the church I grew up in, I had no opportunities to see sheroes professionally. In our church, and many of the churches of its kind, the men could be only the ones who served as deacons. They could be the only ones to pastor a church. They got to make all the money calls about how the money was spent. And they got to make all decisions about how long the preacher got to stay. And in my church, since it was in North Carolina, they seldom really came to worship. They stood out under a tree and smoked cigarettes until they said, well, it's time for preaching. The women had sung the hymns and the prayers were over, and so the men came in just to listen to the sermon. That said, as I grew up, I should also say that all the mission money that had to be raised in the church was left to be raised by the women. All the Sunday school teaching was left to be done by the women. Almost all the Bible school, the weeks that went by in the early days, were expected to be taken care of by the women. And anything else that happened that was worthwhile, like tending to those who were in grief with pound cakes, that was expected to be done by the women. So actually the ministry of the church was all done by the women. It was only the men who held the positions of, honor. Professionally, however, as I got older and outgrew my preacher boy status and got to college, there were heroes that emerged in my life that will stay with me even though they are mostly long since dead. One of the early ones was a guy named Carlisle Marney who pastored Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. He had been at University Baptist in Austin, Texas before that. He had this booming voice. And while much of the time he stayed way above my head theologically, because he was quite brilliant, I was always convinced that if God actually did show up and there was a rapture, that the voice that I would hear booming from the heavens would be like Carlisle Marney's voice. He was so brilliant and so wonderful. Then there was a guy named Will Campbell. I love Will Campbell because he was a rebel rouser, always starting trouble. He challenged the institutional church at every place and every time and irritated just about everybody that he came in contact with. But he was wonderful. His gospel and his deep sense of the gospel of reconciliation, so that when Martin Luther King was shot and when George Wallace was shot, the families made sure they contacted Will Campbell, and he had a ministry to the Ku Klux Klan, even though he was the most radical person in terms of integration that one could imagine in the South. He was something. And then there was Clarence Jordan, who started a community farm, a communal farm in Georgia in the 1940s, and they were bombed and they were persecuted. But that was a place where blacks and whites could gather to work and to grow and to learn from each other and respect each other and to live out the gospel in the midst of a state that hardly knew what the gospel was about when it came to race. And out of that farm came seeds that grew into other things. Under Clarence's leadership, a guy was converted who began a little project called Habitat for Humanity, and no one could have imagined where that went. And out of that came the bicyclists who were here this past week, like 35 of them, who ride around building houses, and we had the honor of being able to host those folk as they were on the way to do good. All of that came out of this Koinonia farm in Americus, Georgia. Amazing. And then, least but not last, was a dry Baptist preacher named John Claypool. You've heard about him because I preached some sermons about the death of his daughter, Laura Lou, last fall. He pastored Crescent Hill Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky, and Broadway and Fort Worth amongst some others. He became an Episcopal priest. He's the only person I've ever heard who could do a monotone sermon by script and keep me hanging on every word. And when it came to spiritual heroes, I tried to make a way, when I was in college and seminary, to weasel in to places where I could hear these people. You know, to know somebody who knew somebody so that I could sit at table and learn from those people whom I respected. Claypool, the last time I was able to gather with him was in Bowie's Creek, North Carolina, a little Baptist school called Kimball. And at the Baptist parsonage there, because I had a dear friend who was dating the daughter of the Baptist preacher, I weaseled a way in to gather with a small group of people around Claypool. And he shared, I remember, many stories, but one of the things he shared was a conversation he was having with a pastor who had talked about the future of his ministry. And he said this pastor said, if I can get a grip, if I can understand, if I can see what I want my ministry to look like 10 years from now, then I could plan what discipline I need to be engaged in now that would get me there. It's kind of an insight that has stuck with me. We always hear about people talking about we need enough discipline. There's not enough discipline in the schools. There's not enough discipline here and there and about. And of course, I heard more about that because I guess it was assumed I needed more discipline. But discipline is the most useless thing in the world if you have no idea what your goal is. You've got to decide what the goal is. In other words, what I would say today and what this pastor was saying, you've got to decide who or what you want to be 10 years from now, and then you develop the plan that will get you there. To be that person, to have that ministry, to reach those goals. That brings me to the conversation. Who do you want to be in 2020? What do you want to do in 2020? Every year, we should be taking stock of that question. And so, you can find no better role model, no finer hero in the Bible, if you will, than the person that emerges in the book of Acts. 3 different places he's found in a powerful situation. And in each case, he rises to another level of hopefulness and light. Let's begin with that 4th chapter piece, if we may. The church had now kind of run past the passion and the power of Easter and Pentecost. The religious establishment, and because when the religious establishment had any dissent going and there were ripples in the system, then Rome became interested because it might have political implications. And so the authorities had begun to line up and cock their eyebrow and look at these folk who were people of the way, the followers of Jesus. They, having gotten past Easter and the power and joy of Pentecost, now were finding themselves pressed. And some of the pressing came with some economic sanctions of sorts, not official, but implicitly in the system. That's what happens with the persecution. You can starve folk out if you work long enough and hard enough. And so the church rallies at this point because they begin gathering and they begin sharing the resources that they have against this hurdle, this challenge that has come before them. People in general are not named. You know that? You notice in the text. It's just, the followers, the believers. Except there's one person named, Joseph, whom the disciples began calling Barnabas, son of encouragement. He must have had a significant piece of land because he sees the hurdle. He believes that the work of God is the work of God and the Spirit is still moving, and he sells his land and he brings the proceeds and he puts it at the disciples' feet to be used for those most vulnerable. In a moment when the church faced its first real challenge, and people needed to be inspired, and people needed to find a way forward, Barnabas, named Son of Encouragement, stepped forward to share what God had given him, because he was always looking for the work of the Spirit and how the church needed to be doing the work of following Jesus. What a great thing to do. What a great act of faith, if you will. We find Barnabas again a little farther over. And it's kind of an interesting situation we run into him again, because now he has some status with the leaders in Jerusalem. There is this guy named Saul, a Pharisee, who's been creating chaos and havoc. In fact, he has blood on his hands. He's overseen the martyrdom of Stephen, one of the first deacons. People fear him because he has brought with him sanctions to put to death those who were problematic to the religious establishment of his day. He's had an experience. He's met the living Christ on the road to Damascus. He's seen light. He's been changed. What he wants is, he wants access to the leaders of the Jerusalem church, because he has a vision of ministry and he needs and wants the blessing. Well, imagine, if you will, a board of mice. And there's a massive cat who wants to meet with you in your room because he sees that his interest and your interest are the same. Well, you can imagine how that went down. They didn't trust him. They dared not meet with him, sanction him, anything. This Saul, who would become Paul the Apostle, one of the great evangelists of the early church, would have found himself out in the cold, and his work probably would have been more difficult. But Barnabas listens, and he kind of investigates, and he verifies that indeed Saul has had this experience. And there's evidence that he's had this experience, and he has a powerful witness and the capability of preaching. He was, after all, a well-trained Pharisee. And Barnabas goes to the elders in the church and says, hey, this cat really is a mouse in disguise. We really need his gifts. We really need to allow him to share his witness and testimony of having met the living Christ. Barnabas is the go-between. He has the courage to stand up in solidarity with Saul, who would become Paul. And not only that, but once they allow and protect Saul to escape from those who were after him, Barnabas teams up with him and takes off on this first great missionary journey. And Gentile churches were formed all over the known world of that area and day. Churches were blooming. Why? Because Barnabas had the courage to stand up. I think of how many times I have watched people and I've wondered about their gifts, and I sit on the sidelines, and rather than be like Barnabas and be an encourager, I've kind of kept silent. I've had more seminary interns and been involved in more ordinations than I care to think about. And sometimes it frightens me what I've helped turn loose on the church. They still keep up with me. I can't get rid of them. And yet their gifts have been sometimes incredible. But for everyone that I've encouraged and helped, there are those when I sat on the sideline and stayed silent, when what they needed was a word that says, yes, I see those gifts. They have a place. Finally, we run into Barnabas again. Churches have been founded. It's kind of amazing. Now they've got to come back to Jerusalem because the people in Jerusalem are not really sure the gospel's for everybody. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Don't you think the church ought to grow up someday? Throughout the ages, we've just kind of dragged those chains with us across from age to age. Well, we're not really sure the church ought to be, receiving these people. Thank God, people like Barnabas and Paul were listening to the Spirit, and so they came. And there was a conversation. Should these Gentiles be asked to be Jewish? It was the first great Jerusalem council, and a deal was cut. We don't need to get in the details. I didn't put all the details up here because I figured that I'd put you to sleep. I didn't want that to put you to sleep, right? So, they come. A deal is worked out. An offering's taken for those most vulnerable in the church in Jerusalem. They, meaning Paul and Barnabas, are encouraged to go back to work, and they decide to go back and recheck on the churches, to encourage the churches. It's at that point Barnabas wants to take Mark. He's run off and left him the first time around. He's abandoned the mission. Paul has no use for that. Paul was a little hot-headed. If you read enough of Paul, you may get some of that. He wants nothing to do with Mark. Barnabas says, no, Mark has a place. Once again, the son of encouragement sees that God is a God of second chances. That God is a God who won't give up on people. There's a heated discussion, apparently. We could almost say we had a church fight, but we know the church never fights. And it was decided that they would go their separate ways. Paul picked up Silas and they went, and their ministry was blessed again. But Barnabas took Mark with him. Here's where we lose Barnabas, the son of encouragement. We don't hear about him again, except a footnote. In Timothy, Paul's in prison, and he's in trouble, and he has needs, and so he writes asking for John Mark to be sent to him because he might be helpful to Paul's ministry. Isn't that something? That suddenly Paul now sees the gifts of this young disciple, this young minister. And he writes because he says, I have need for him. Who is the Barnabas in your life, or the Batnamus? Because, it could be bar for son or bat for daughter, whatever. Who is that for you? Or have you pondered, have you been privileged to be a son or daughter of comfort, of encouragement for someone else? I tell you who I want to be in 2020. I always choose small goals. I want to be like Barnabas. I want to be able to see the work of the Spirit and be engaged by that work, to see how God is moving. I want to be able to encourage people to use their gifts in their place, in their time, to flesh out the love of God, because the world needs so much love right now in the chaos. I want to be that person. I'm not sure yet what discipline is going to sustain me. I have a pretty good idea if I have the grit and encouragement and the courage to do that. But I want to be like Barnabas. Such a worthy hero. How about you? Who do you want to be? What do you want to be in 2020? I know the goals that get said, well, I'm going to pay off all my debt this year, or I'm going to lose 165 pounds. And I only weigh 185, but I'll look good at 20 pounds. I'm talking about a larger goal. I'm talking about powerful stuff. I hope you'll think about that, because I've been thinking about that a lot these past days.